Care Talk with Laura Packard is a podcast covering healthcare in America from a progressive perspective. Our healthcare system is broken, and we all know insurance companies are out of control. If you don't have health insurance or don't understand the differences between insurance plans, or have surprise medical bills, out of control prescription drug costs, or can't get the care you need, listen to Care Talk with Laura Packard weekly on Tuesdays. What's going to happen to your healthcare under the Trump administration? From prescription drug prices to health insurance costs, from healthcare for seniors and people with disabilities to reproductive care, from care for veterans to public health, including vaccinations. Healthcare experts answer your questions every week, and they go in-depth on Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, private insurance, and more. Go to healthcarevoices.org/caretalk or search for Care Talk with Laura Packard on your favorite podcast app to listen today.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun.
And welcome to This Week's Unspun. In today's episode, we're going to look at objectivity. Lots of people are accusing the media of having one bias or another. And the same piece of media, for example, like the New York Times, is being accused of being biased both as a liberal direction and as a conservative direction. So what's going on here? Where does this idea of objectivity even come from? Are journalists obligated to present all sides of an issue? And what happens if they don't? For those questions and more, let's get unspun. But before we do, thank you so much to those of you who left reviews in your podcast apps, because when you do that, it helps make the information more visible to other podcast listeners. Your star ratings and comments really help a lot, in fact. So if you have the time right here in the app where you're listening now, would you take a second and just leave a quick rating or review? I'd really appreciate it, as I'm trying to make as many people media literate as I can. Okay, let's get down to it. So objectivity. It's a word that's been used to define journalism for more than a century. Kind of a compass guiding how reporters are supposed to do their jobs. Today, it's common to hear journalists say things like, "I'm just reporting the facts," or "I'm staying neutral." And as news consumers, many of us are taught to trust that stance, believing that objectivity is what separates journalism from propaganda. But is it really? Let's take a step back. Where did this idea come from? And how did it become so foundational to the way we expect news to work, at least in Western countries? To understand that, we have to go back to a time when journalism looked really different. To the early 1800s, when news came from newspapers, and those newspapers were openly partisan. So you could maybe picture a newspaper in the 1830s. Its editor might be a vocal supporter of Andrew Jackson, or a fierce opponent. Every headline, every article, every political cartoon reflected that clear stance. These weren't just facts that were laid out for the public to interpret, they were arguments aimed at convincing readers that one side, or one party, was right. And in that era, papers didn't hide their political leanings, they flaunted them, and the readers actually expected that. But then this started to change with the rise of the penny press. Because in big cities like New York and Philadelphia, newspaper publishers saw a new opportunity. How about if you could sell your paper to not just the political class, but to everyone? Not just lawyers and merchants, but to dock workers and shop clerks and immigrants. A wider audience meant more sales, and more sales meant more advertising money. But to appeal to everyone, you had to tone down the politics. You had to sound neutral, or at least neutral enough that people from different political backgrounds could still find something worth reading. And this was the first shift, not towards objectivity as a moral principle, but as a business strategy. And it did work. Now, by the late 1800s, this commercial model had evolved further with the creation of wire services, the one you've probably heard of as the Associated Press. These organizations gathered news from across the country and then delivered it to other newspapers nationwide. But there was a catch. Those newspapers often had very different political views. So, stories had to be written in a way that wouldn't offend anyone. What emerged was a kind of a stripped-down reporting. It was short and factual and emotionless. Reporters were expected to write in a style that could be used word for word by papers on both sides of the aisle. So you can imagine the AP reporter on a train platform in 1898 covering the sinking of the USS Maine. He's got a notebook and a tight deadline, and the pressure to describe what happened without editorializing. So the tone had to be flat, and the facts had to be clear, and the message had to be usable in Boston and in Birmingham, in Democrat and Republican cities alike. And this created conditions for what we now call objective reporting, writing that leaves out opinion, avoids emotional language, and presents the story in a way that feels detached. This wasn't just about style, it was also about legitimacy. As journalism professionalized in the early 20th century, reporters began to think of themselves as more than note-takers and writers. They were professionals, like doctors or lawyers, people with a public duty and a code of ethics. And that is when objectivity stopped being just a business strategy and became a principle. One of the loudest voices in this movement was Walter Lippmann. In the aftermath of World War I, he was really concerned with how poorly the press had covered major global events, especially the Russian Revolution. He argued that news coverage was full of errors and rumors and ideological spin. And what was worse was that the public didn't really have a good way to sort truth from fiction. And I hope that sounds kind of familiar to you because I feel like we're kind of that way today. Lippmann wanted journalists to be more scientific, not in the sense of lab coats and test tubes, but in their approach to information. He wanted them to rely on evidence, to verify their sources, and to approach their stories with discipline and with skepticism. He didn't think reporters could ever be fully neutral, but he did believe they could be methodical, that if they followed the right process, they could come closer to the truth. Now, by the 1920s, journalism schools, editorial guidelines, and industry ethics were all embracing this version of objectivity. And by the middle of the 20th century, it was firmly entrenched, not just in how stories were written, but in how newsrooms were organized, how editors evaluated work, and even how the public judged credibility. But here's where the story shifts. Even as objectivity became kind of a gold standard in journalism, there were some cracks in the foundation that started to show, and this was particularly put to the test during moments of crisis or injustice. So let's look at one of those moments, the Civil Rights Movement. In the 1950s and 60s, as Black Americans across the South organized to challenge segregation and demand voting rights, journalists faced a dilemma. How do you cover a story that is both political and moral, one that involves violence and racism and power, and still stay neutral? Now, some reporters did try to stick to the norms of objectivity. They reported the facts, interviewed leaders on both sides, and avoided emotional language. But that approach sometimes produced stories that gave equal weight to deeply unequal perspectives. Listen to this clip from Jim Bennett, who was a reporter at the time.
Well, it was the best of times and the worst of times for a reporter. There was plenty to write about, a lot of interesting stories. You didn't have to look far for them. When 25,000 people are at the doorstep of the state capitol, something big is about to take place. But just as it was dangerous for demonstrators and maybe even law enforcement officers at times, reporters were under the gun as well. They were often times pointed out by political leaders, Bull Connor, Governor Wallace, would say, there they are, those are reporters, some from the New York Times and other papers, and the crowd was not always pleased by your presence. Got a lot of hate mail. Reporters really, at that time, tried to cover events objectively. And when you cover both sides, sometimes the other side that's being written about doesn't like it. But that's the job of a newspaper reporter. We weren't taking sides. I don't know of any reporter that was emotionally involved in one side or the other. They were just there doing their job.
Now you can look at the events in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a series of nonviolent protests against segregation, the city responded with force. Police unleashed dogs to attack demonstrators, and firefighters turned high-power fire hoses on children. They also arrested hundreds of people. Images from Birmingham shocked the world, with some print stories trying to appear balanced quoted city officials justifying the violence in the name of public order. And these quotes were often presented with little pushback. The protests were sometimes framed as disruptions or controversial tactics, as if the demand for equal rights was just another political opinion. And here's another thing to consider as you're listening to a podcast. If you had been a reader about these events and you were living in another part of the country, and you didn't see the photos or the film footage, you just saw the text of the article, would you fully understand what had happened? Or would you come away thinking both sides had a point? That is the danger of what critics later called false equivalency, the attempt to appear fair by treating two sides as equally valid, even when one is rooted in oppression. You can go back to the late 1800s when newspapers reported on lynchings in the American South. These were brutal public executions, often of Black men, and often based on rumors or false accusations. And rather than condemning the violence, many newspapers reported it in these dry, detached tones, calling it mob justice or explaining that the victim had allegedly committed a crime. Because they were trying to appear objective, these stories often repeated the same racial narratives that justified the violence. An effort at fairness became a kind of silence, a refusal to take a moral stance even when people were being murdered. And even reporters knew it. Here's CNN's Christiane Amanpour, a war reporter, talking about her time covering Bosnia.
In Europe, it was really terrible. But I suddenly realized that actually, you know what? Objectivity doesn't mean neutrality. Objectivity means getting all sides of the story, and sure enough, we crossed the lines at great personal danger and risk. We went to get the story from the Bosnian Serbs. I interviewed them all the time, but I was mostly on the side, in the location where the victims were, because that was where the story was, and that's what we do. And when you get all sides of the story, you're being objective. But when you then mistakenly believe that objectivity is neutrality, that means you start to try to create a false factual and false moral equivalence. And that, in these situations, becomes, if you do that, you are then an accomplice. And I knew there and then that I was not going to be an accomplice to genocide, ethnic cleansing, or any of those kinds of terrible violations of international humanitarian law and just basic humanity.
This is a hard truth, but it raises a critical question for journalism. Is staying neutral always the same as being fair? And what happens when neutrality becomes an excuse to not confront injustice? I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we'll dig a little bit more into objectivity. Welcome back. We've covered a little bit about what objectivity means, so now let's think about who gets to claim it. Because one of the more uncomfortable truths about journalism is that not everyone is given the same room to be seen as neutral. To see what this looks like in real life, consider two journalists covering the same story, a protest after a police shooting. One is a white reporter who spent their career covering politics, and the other is a Black reporter who grew up in the neighborhood where the shooting happened. Who's going to be seen as more objective? And who's more likely to be questioned for bias if they tweet a personal reaction or share an emotional quote? Over the last decade, many journalists of color have spoken out about this double standard, and one of the most vocal voices is Wesley Lowery. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who came to national attention during the Ferguson protests in 2014. He was on the ground reporting on the unrest that followed the police killing of Michael Brown, who was an unarmed Black teenager. In his reporting, Lowery was careful and he followed the facts, but he also used his personal Twitter account to share about what he was seeing, including his moments of chaos and fear and anger. He tweeted about the tear gas in the streets, about police confronting protesters and reporters, and in one now widely shared tweet, he simply said, "I've been tear gassed." And that became a problem. His editors at the Washington Post reportedly questioned whether his tweets were crossing a line, whether they made him appear biased. And Lowery later left the paper. In 2020, he wrote a powerful op-ed in the New York Times titled "A Reckoning Over Objectivity," led by Black journalists, which I'll include in the show notes on Substack this week. In that piece, he argued that the traditional idea of objectivity often forces journalists of color to erase their own lived experience, to pretend that they're outside of the story even when they're deeply connected to it. Meanwhile, white journalists, whose backgrounds often align with the dominant culture, are rarely told that they're too close to a story. He wrote, "No journalistic process is objective and no individual journalist is objective because no human being is." So think about that for a moment. If no person is truly neutral, then the goal of journalism can't be neutrality. Instead, it has to be honesty or accuracy or transparency. Lowry called for something else, not neutrality, but moral clarity. An approach to journalism that acknowledges right and wrong, that focuses on truth-telling, and that doesn't hide behind balance when the facts speak for themselves. Journalists struggle with this sometimes. Have a listen to this clip.
There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
So you did say it. Do you still believe it?
Well, here's what I would say. First of all, I'm not anti-vaccine.
How is that statement not anti-vaccine?
Well, I can say right now there's no medicine for cancer that's safe and effective. It doesn't mean I'm out against all medicines. I've been fighting 40 years to get mercury out of fish. Nobody calls me anti-fish. What I want is vaccines that are proven safety.
That was Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., who was our Health and Human Services Secretary in the United States right now. We've seen vaccination as a place where this kind of false balance may be showing up, particularly in the way that journalists have handled the claims that RFK Jr. has made. He's been a public figure for decades. He was known first for his environmental activism, but also for promoting the false belief that vaccines are linked to autism, which is a claim that scientific studies have repeatedly disproven. But for some reason, he was consistently given space on major media platforms, including CNN, to share his views. In early interviews and televised segments, Kennedy's vaccine skepticism was sometimes presented as just one side of a controversial issue. And they'd have a scientist or a public health expert come on to explain the overwhelming consensus behind vaccine safety, and then Kennedy would present his counter-arguments. And the goal, I guess, was balance, letting both sides speak. But here's the problem. There was no scientific debate. The evidence just didn't support both sides, but the format suggested otherwise. And that's the definition of false balance, and it had consequences. When a network like CNN gives airtime to anti-vaccine claims without directly and forcefully challenging them, it risks misleading viewers into thinking the science is still an open question, when in fact it isn't. This became especially important during COVID-19 pandemic, when vaccine hesitancy became just a national crisis. And Kennedy's anti-vaccine rhetoric found new audiences online, and scientists and journalists and public health experts really harshly criticized his appearances in mainstream media. So, for example, Dr. Peter Hotez, a vaccine researcher and science communicator, said it's not a debate. It's misinformation versus decades of peer-reviewed science. In response, some networks, including CNN, began shifting their approach, and so segments were more tightly fact-checked. And RFK Jr. was no longer brought on as a counterpoint, at least until he became the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which created new issues in covering him. So we've got this idea that objectivity might actually limit truth instead of protecting it. And that's opened doors to new ways of thinking about journalism. These approaches reject the idea that detachment always equals credibility. Instead, they kind of argue that journalists can and should bring their full selves to their work. And that includes their values, their questions, and their understanding of the community they're covering. This does not, though, mean abandoning facts. What it means instead is reporting facts in context, being honest about what they mean. And it's gotten a lot more complicated than it was back in the penny press days, because the way we consume news has completely changed. We can start with the 24-hour news cycle. In the past, newsrooms worked for very fixed deadlines, the evening broadcast or the morning paper. Now, every second is a deadline for the social media feed or the 24-hour broadcast, and the pressure to be first, to break a story before anyone else is constant. I mean, imagine you're a reporter at a news station and there's a mass shooting in your town. Social media is already going to be flooded with videos and unconfirmed reports and names of victims and even potential motives. And your editor's going to want an update every 10 minutes, and your competitors are already publishing, and your audience is watching and refreshing and demanding information right this very second. And in that environment, those usual steps of careful sourcing and verification and editorial review, these are all tools that enable objectivity, and they start to break down. And so mistakes do happen. Tweets get deleted, headlines change midstream. But once a false piece of information is out there, it is nearly impossible to reel it back in. And then we're going to add on social media, because journalists are no longer just reporters, they're also personalities. So they're expected to post and respond and share and promote. And these posts are visible to everyone, readers and critics and politicians and bosses. And here's a complication. If a journalist shares a personal opinion, even outside of work, does that affect their perceived objectivity? The criticism of Wilson Lowry comes to mind here, and there have been real cases where journalists have been suspended or reprimanded or even fired for tweets or posts that were seen as too political. And the scrutiny often falls harder on journalists from marginalized backgrounds. So it creates sort of a double bind. You can stay silent and be seen as neutral, or speak up and risk being seen as biased. But there's another side to the digital shift. The internet has also democratized information in ways that could strengthen journalism when used carefully. Journalists can link directly to their sources, they can share their work, they can cite the data, explain the methodology, give the full transcript of an interview. And these kinds of transparency can build trust, especially among readers who want to see the process beyond a headline. The digital world also allows for a wider range of perspectives. Journalists today have access to stories and voices that were harder to find in the past, to activists on the ground, to local eyewitnesses, to experts from unrepresented communities. And if they use this well, it can make richer, more inclusive reporting. But, and this is a big but, when it's easy to access both sides, it also makes it easier to create false equivalents, to amplify misinformation, and to legitimize dangerous or unsupported claims. Because carefully reported news is often paywalled and disinformation is often free. So once again, the question returns. What does objectivity mean in a world where everyone has a platform and every second is a headline? We've talked about how objectivity developed, how it's applied unevenly, and how the digital age has pushed it in new directions. But now we need to turn the lens on you and me, truth seekers, the audience. Because one of the biggest forces reshaping journalism today isn't just technology or new news norms and ethics, it's polarization. In a deeply divided political climate, the idea of objective journalism faces a whole new kind of challenge because people don't always agree on what's biased or even what's true. Think about this. Maybe you're watching a national news segment on immigration policy, and it includes interviews with migrants, analysis of new legislation, statements from both parties. The facts are carefully sourced, the tone is measured. If the story does not align with what you already believe about immigration, if it doesn't match the values you already have, you might still walk away thinking, that felt biased. And that's not just a gut reaction, it's something researchers have studied. Political scientists call this the hostile media effect. The tendency for people to view neutral or balanced reporting as biased against their side. In other words, two people can read the same article and both believe it was unfair for opposite reasons. And then we can add that to the rise of partisan media outlets, especially online, where entire news ecosystems exist just to serve one political identity. These spaces don't just report the news. As I talked about in my episode on news commentary, these outlets frame it, they interpret it, they validate it through a specific lens. And when audiences spend most of their time inside these echo chambers, any stories from outside, even if they're careful, well-sourced ones, will start to look sketchy. For some people, this trust in the press is not just a belief, it's a part of their identity. It doesn't matter how many fact checks are included. If it comes from a particular source or a journalist perceived as other, it's dismissed on site. And this puts journalists in a real bind, because they're trained to follow the facts. Or, on the other hand, the more those facts clash with someone's beliefs, the more likely they are to be accused of bias. And sometimes, in response to that pressure, journalists do try to overcorrect. You've probably seen this in action. So a reporter covering climate change includes a quote from a scientist and then immediately balances it with a quote from someone sponsored by the petroleum industry who offers climate skepticism. This isn't because the evidence supports both sides, because the reporter wants to avoid the appearance of bias, and that's false balance, and it's dangerous. In doing that, ironically, journalism can mislead the public when they're trying to act in the name of fairness. There's something else happening behind the scenes, and we can call it strategic bias. This happens when a journalist or a newsroom, under fire for being too liberal or too biased, starts including opposing views or framing stories in ways that lean slightly the other way, not because the facts demand it, but to deflect criticism. It's not always intentional, but it's real. And over time, it can bend the public conversation toward a narrowing middle, when it may no longer reflect the actual facts or values in a society. So what happens? You get a feedback loop. Trust in journalism erodes, and audiences become more suspicious, and that suspicion forces journalists to change how they present the news, and then those changes reinforce the belief that something is off. The idea of objectivity, which was once meant to build credibility, now becomes part of the fight. So where does this leave you, truth seekers? The answer isn't about picking sides. It's about learning to understand how journalism works, how bias can show up, and how to critically evaluate the information that you're taking in. So start with the basics. Know what kind of content you're looking at. Are you looking at a news article, reporting facts and with evidence and statements and actions? Are you looking at analysis, which gives context, helping you understand why something matters? Or are you looking at an opinion piece that's just arguing a point of view? These are interchangeable, but it's not always obvious which is which. Headlines can blur those lines, and social media gets rid of nuance pretty much completely. But slowing down to ask, is this news or analysis or commentary? It's the first simple step that can make a big difference. You can also look at the source. Who owns the particular outlet? What is their mission? Do they have a clean line between news and commentary? Do they name their sources and explain where they get their information? Because good journalism should be transparent about its process. It doesn't mean it's always right, but it does give you a way to check. And here's something that's key. Check more than one source. You don't have to read 10 articles on every topic, but if you only get your news from one perspective, even if it's one you trust and agree with, you may be missing something. So reading across outlets can show you not just different conclusions, but different questions that are being asked. And that's where some real insight can live. You can also do your own fact-checking. This is especially important in today's landscape. Something seems too perfect, too outrageous. If it just seems to fit your beliefs perfectly, maybe pause and look it up. See if independent fact-checking organizations like factcheck.org have weighed in. So just don't rely on your gut alone. And then be cautious of false equivalency. Just because a story quotes two sides doesn't mean those sides are equally credible. If one side's backed by data and the other is just unverified claims, you deserve to know that. And good reporting is going to make that clear. But do understand that truth isn't always neutral. And maybe it doesn't have to be, because journalists aren't robots, they're people. And you, as a reader or a listener, you don't need them to hide that. What you need, and what journalism owes you, is honesty about the process, clarity about the content, and commitment to accuracy. If you can approach news with that in mind and ask the right questions, you don't just become a more informed citizen, you become a partner in the journalistic process. At the end, you can be someone who helps hold the work accountable, not to some outdated idea of neutrality, but to the deeper goal of truth. Stay sharp out there, truth seekers.
Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone. It's no surprise that newsmakers try to manipulate the audience. They want you to believe that they are the one holding the line and they'll use any trick they can to get you there. But don't let them fool you. Get unspun. I'm Amanda Sturgill. I've been a reporter, and today I teach future reporters to cut the spin and think critically about what newsmakers say. My podcast, Unspun, shows you how to know when you're being manipulated by the news. Learn to spot the tricks and how to make up your own mind about what's true. So if you're tired of being fooled by the news, subscribe to Unspun today. Unspun, because you deserve the truth.